Hi, everyone. Welcome to Georgetown University and the Beeck Center for Social Impact and Innovation. Delighted to welcome you today for a great conversation with our team and our friends visiting from the UK. I'll get to that shortly, but first, the Beeck Center is one of the centers here at Georgetown University where we take a great mix of practitioner, fellows, students, and an extended team to solve some of society's biggest problems using data, design, and technology. Today, we'll be talking about some of the work that we've been doing here at the Beeck Center for a couple of years, where we've learned how data, design, and technology have made it easier for residents in the United States to apply for and access social safety net benefits, support for housing and nutrition, and education and healthcare. And we're actually here to learn a lot from our friends across the pond who have made great strides in this work. And we're hoping that we can apply some of their lessons to the work we do here at the Beeck Center and then more broadly in the United States. So to start this conversation and introduce our guests, I'd like to introduce Erin Snow. Erin's a fellow here at the Beeck Center who joins us most recently, having served as the CEO of the Canadian Digital Service. We sent Erin up north to help our friends there design new methods for service delivery after Erin spent a number of years in the US government. He was a Presidential Innovation Fellow and then stuck around to found 18F, which is one of the US government's first digital service delivery units that sits in the US General Services Administration. Erin is a lawyer by training and brings lots of other skills in law and tech and policy. And we are thrilled that he's a fellow working with us on a number of our projects here at the Beeck Center. So thank you for being here with us today, joining us for one of our first in-person and hybrid events. And we look forward to the conversation.
Hi folks. Really nice to be here. I'm going to pass it straight on to our guests to get things rolling in just a moment. I do want to note that if this is stuff you're interested in, there's more of it coming next week. Georgetown is running Tech and Society Week all week next week. Lots of programs. You can find it on all the usual suspects, social media. And I'm sure after the program here too, we can tell you more about it if there's anybody here who wants to share more. All right, I am super excited. So almost 10 years ago, I think was when the relationship sort of started between the government digital service in the UK and the folks here in the US who had not yet even created a similar kind of program here. But that's about how long we and our friends have been friends. Laura Sampson and James Stewart are here from Public Digital, both former members of that crew in the UK. Who were doing amazing things and from whom we learned a great deal as we were just setting sail on our own digital services journeys here. Laura in particular was instrumental in program digitalization for the universal credit system of benefits in the UK. And I'm going to hand it off to Laura to take it from there.
Lovely. Thank you. Thank you very much, Aaron. Thank you all for having us. We're going to start with some weird physical activity. This is not a warm-up. This is not a get to know each other thing, but I'm going to walk over there because I have some slides, and that means that I'm going to ask you all to use your swivel chairs to turn around. We're in the back. Everyone who thought they were sitting at the back.
We tried.
Thank you for that. This is all hybrid stuff. So for those of you that have zoomed in, I know you can see the slides and you can't see me, and that is the right way round. So but I'm hoping you can hear me. Please do put something in the chat if you can't. So I hope you can all see stuff. So yes, hi, I am Laura Sampson. I am a partner at Public Digital, and I joined Public Digital coming up for a year ago, having spent about 20 years in the UK civil service. We'll come on a little bit just towards the end of this, where James will pick up on to talk a little bit more about how public digital works with clients to do the sorts of things that I'm talking about that we did in the world of universal credit from within the UK civil service. So I'm going to, having slightly learned a lesson actually yesterday when I was talking a little bit about universal credit, I'm just going to step back a tiny bit to talk about just what it is, kind of setting the scene so that we've got a kind of common understanding. It starts off as a policy idea, which is not the thing I'm going to major on here. But just to explain, it is a social security payment for households that are on a low income, and those can be people who are in or out of work, which was an important part of it. And what it does is it effectively collapses 6 benefits that previously existed, which were a nightmare to navigate for any kind of normal human being. And I'm sure, like you, the kind of guidance documents are like, this deep to just understand the rules. And so it collapses those benefits together so that it covers your essential cost of living to help with that, your housing costs for children, and costs to do with health or disability. And it brings those together, and then it wraps it round in a set of support to help people into work if they're out of work, or potentially to progress in work and earn more. And because fundamentally what it is about is the idea of making it easy to move into the world of work if you're out of work, to remove all of the risks of stopping one benefit, applying for another, and to make work pay. So as you can see from this diagram, endless diagrams that were tried to explain why universal credit was a good thing to kind of the general citizens of the UK. And basically is it shows that if you're out of work, it gives you a certain amount of money. If you move into work, it's simply going to just top that up and adjust depending on your earnings. It is because it brings so much together, it has very significant reach. So in the order of kind of a quarter of families in the UK, well, at any one point in time, are likely to be in receipt of universal credit. So that's the policy idea. I think of more interest probably to this group, though, is what that means as a service idea. And I'm slightly maybe dispel a few myths here, because we were very lucky to have that policy. I mean, it's unheard of in the UK for a minister to come in to a department. Our ministers change as often as you kind of change your socks. So sometimes it feels like we were at a very fortunate moment in time, 2010. We had an election, Conservative government came in, massive landslide, and an absolute clarity of something they wanted to do. They wanted to reform our social security service wholesale for the first time since it had been invented in 1945. So it was a very brave thing to do. And the whole idea was, of course, to simplify it and bring those benefits together. But I just want to dispel the idea that that means it's simple. It is simpler, and certainly the fact of bringing it all together makes it a lot simpler for users of it. It kind of hides the complexity. But underneath it, it is a deeply complex system. And I think it's kind of important to understand that, and we'll come on to a little bit why. And it does bring it together into a single service, but the change experience that we've been on for the past decade has required enormous changes to two of the UK's largest government departments, and in my desperate attempt to reflect some complexity that even comes close to your complexity, something like 350 local authorities, which I know doesn't count in compared to your world, but there is an awful lot of engagement and change that needs to happen on the ground for this to be possible. And we're talking here about digital and data and technology, and it is very, very significant. It's probably UK government's most dramatic step towards seriously digitizing a service. But that does not mean it is a digital only service. And I will talk a bit about how important it is that we've conceived of this as a kind of multi-channel service, with a very strong focus inevitably on people, who are in need of help at, often very dire moments in their lives, and looking after that vulnerability has been an important factor of it. So that's a little bit about the idea of it. So I'm going to do a little bit of history. As I said, this minister turns up in 2010, massive, great big blueprint on his desk, build me one of these, please. And the Department of Work and Pensions quite foolishly said, well, no, happily, I'm very glad to say, in fact, everyone was delighted and said, this is amazing, we've been wanting to do this for years, we definitely want to do it. And he said, by 2013, and we said, okay, that's a very bad idea to say, okay. By 2013, we were 3 years in, nigh on £500 million spent, not a single bit of delivery to be seen for it, and things were going very, very wrong indeed. And I'm going to do a little bit of why things went so wrong, and then I'm going to talk more happily about why they went better. A big reason why is it was seen as a technology project. And obviously, it is not a technology project because you're talking about people whose relationship to the state and the type of support the state will give you needs to change radically for the outcomes of this policy to actually make any difference. So it's not a technology project, it's a human behavior project. And that was one of its biggest problems, as it was treated like that. We also, as I said, okay, 2013, fine, we'll deliver something by that. The minute we made that commitment, everything else was driven by fear of failure to meet that date. And the sort of behaviors that came from that fear was siloed accountability. So work streams of, okay, the technology people do this, the operations people do that, policy people do that. And if we manage them all to within an inch of their lives, we'll hit that date. It's not going to happen. The kind of drive for full certainty, if we plan in more and more levels of detail, we are more likely to hit the 2013 date. And the more we say that everything's going okay, there's the enormous hiding of the problems, including to ministers, in a way that is not really acceptable in my view for kind of civil servants. So driving that kind of promising things that you just don't know you can deliver. And then lastly, I think, and quite insanely when you think about it, that fear means you're trying to minimize change in a world where the thing you need to do is radically change. So the behaviors are why, by the time we got to 2013, the project was in a not good position. And because of the standards and controls that the government digital service had put in place, it had the authority to come in and say, you got to stop and you've got to start completely again, with a whole new way of thinking about it. And now I have to apologise to anyone who saw some of this presentation yesterday. Little bit of a repeat, but that's because there's no point not saying things that I think are important. So I want to reflect on what those principles were that Government Digital Service, with some of us in the Department for Work and Pensions, adopted in a really, really ruthless way. Like, we're not breaking these principles if we're going to have a chance of making this successful. So the first of these was this idea of starting small and test and learn. So we never used the word agile. The word agile had become jargon. It belonged to the digital people, and it just made people glaze over. So we invented a term. I don't think it matters what the term was particularly, but test and learn, other than the fact that they are all normal words that people use in their everyday life and they know what they mean, which helps. And we put this phrase, test and learn, at the very, very heart of the programme. So people stood up in our parliament and said, we are going to do this and we're going to do it by testing and learning. So it was like right up there in terms of the communication. And we're going to accept that we don't know what the answer is. We can't write the requirements because we don't know what they are. So we're going to say that, and we're going to be okay with that, because we can say, but we do have a plan. That means that we know how we're going to learn what people need. We're going to learn what it needs to look like. And therefore we started, you can only do that by starting very small. So we started in a sub postcode, which is like your zip codes, of a quite small town chosen for being the most average town in the UK, which offends the good people of Sutton, which is in England. And we started there with 100 users. So ultimately, you know, we're kind of during the post-pandemic, we're about 6 million. So, and this is 2014 we started. So 100 users, but 100 users of any type that might be entitled to. So we didn't say, okay, if you're a complicated sort of person, you can't come in, because we just want to, you know, we will learn about whoever turns up, and we will start building the service out and iterate the design from there. So that was a really key principle and carried all the way through. And actually, I should add, from a programmatic point of view, we had an excellent program director who just said, right, we do need a plan, but the plan is the plan until something changes or we learn something that means it has to change. And that's so the whole way through, we grew slowly. And at one point, we just stopped. This is going off course, stop, like, get back on course, resume, because things had changed. So that principle carried throughout. We established, like, what I would say truly multidisciplinary teams. So this is the first team that existed in Universal Credit. And in this team are people that you would expect. So there are engineers, there are product managers, user researchers, designers, but there are also people in that team that are operational delivery people, policy people, and security people. And that kind of idea of bringing those people together 100% of their time, like, dedicated to the purpose of Universal Credit, not, oh, I'm here to represent commercials and the needs of commercials, but I'm here to bring my expertise as a member of this team to make decisions, design, prioritization, and so on. So that was a really, really important principle. And we grew slowly over the years from 2013. So, you know, the team continues, even though I'm not there. It's amazing. That kind of principle of growing slowly to the point where there are kind of about 20 teams, about 300 people, has been completely fundamental to the success and the ongoing. I mean, it will continue forever of Universal Credit as a service. And one thing I wanted to reflect on is how, when you can find other teams across government, when you're trying to join up, if you can find other teams like that, how incredibly powerful it is. So not only did we have these multidisciplinary teams within Universal Credit, but we had to connect to other services. So we did a lot of work to connect to the identity service in the UK, being run out of GDS, actually. And having teams where you've got engineer to engineer having discussions, rather than, you know, IT contract manager to IT contract manager having discussions, or where you've got product manager to product managers, like, looking at what your roadmaps might look like, is incredibly powerful. And we spent quite a lot of our time trying to find similar types of teams across government that you can work with, and it releases an enormous amount of power and energy. And just one other thing, and we'll talk a little bit more about this, James will probably pick up a bit on this, is probably one of the most important people in this room, and it is this lady here. She was from operational delivery, and I personally, as product director, made it my mission to be best friends with the operational delivery people. And I would say, if anyone said, like, what was your most important relationship? I would say probably that one. And I'll come a little bit onto why at the end. I think this one is fairly obvious, but hard to do. So making sure that the team and the entire program structure is interested in outcomes or solving problems and not solutions. So, you know, our very high level outcome was this, you know, supporting people to find more work, and give them financial support when they were in need. And the really important thing is that everything the teams were working to had an outcome or a problem that was a subset of this. And I personally spent a lot of my mind telling people that I wasn't going to build them what I would call a widget. So, like, you know, I was asked to build quite a lot of portals for different people. So all sorts of different solutions, and always bringing every conversation back to what is the outcome really clearly that the teams are working on was incredibly important. And then to deliver against those outcomes, I haven't got a better phrase than end to end. So I would kind of explain what I mean, that in order to meet an outcome, you need to take on the scope that is required to achieve the outcome. So in our world, that scope had to involve all channels. So you've got a job centre, here, you've got a prison here, a contact centre and someone using digital service. So you're looking at all your users, all your channels. You're looking at kind of the operating model of the organisation. So what job roles do we need? And we let our scope be determined by the outcomes we were trying to achieve. And that's quite hard for an organisation, because they're like, why? Like, operational people be like, who are you to say what our lines of accountability are? And it's like, well, it's going to make a difference to the service. So that's a necessary part of our scope. So those were the kind of those really important key principles. And you know, I'm probably in my whole life, the thing I'm most proud of from a work point of view, obviously my children are amazing, is the fact that when we, and my husband is too, just in case if this is being recorded. Come the pandemic and the worst of the pressure on universal credit as a system in March 2020, we were able to take on that level of pressure. So we had a week or so where we had 500% increase in claims. And it is important that we that universal credit is hosted in the cloud and that the infrastructure could scale and be resilient to that. But that is not actually the thing that made it possible, or it's not the only thing that made it possible for us to pay, the vast majority of people their entitlement on time and in full. The thing that actually made that possible was that relationship with operational delivery and those multidisciplinary empowered teams, because they knew that if they could make this change, that change, this change, and despite the complexity of that ecosystem, they knew what would happen. And we have very, very well-developed data that would just tell us what was happening minute by minute. And we made, multiple changes day after day after day in an organization that had come to trust us that we wouldn't break it. So those principles made us as an organization be able to respond to the worst of those pressures. But maybe maybe more importantly for the longer term is it means that delivery is no longer an obstacle to making policy choices. So during the pandemic, we put an extra £20 a week on everyone's universal credit. And I know you've had the same sort of things here over time and kind of towards the end of last year, that there was a big debate about whether or not that £20 should come off or continue. And what we were able to do as much though it was tempting to say, no, it's really, really, really difficult to take it off. What we were able to do is say, like, that is a policy choice. We can put it up, we can take it off, we can, give it to a subset of people. But you couldn't use like implementation challenges as a way of determining that. And actually, really powerfully, we were able, because we can make changes so quickly, we were able to hold that off till really, like, we were desperate for it not to be taken off, and we're absolutely desperate. And we were able to hold off, not saying, no, you've still got more time, no, you've still got more time, to let really the politics of it play out. And I think, we now have a service infrastructure that allows us to respond to rapidly changing policy demands and that kind of environment as it emerges. So I'm going to stop on universal credit. As I said, those kind of core principles are something that public digital engaged a lot of clients in kind of making those possible. And so I'm going to hand over to James to talk a bit about how we're doing that with another client. So I'm going to leave that up there, and I'm going to walk back here, and everyone can turn around.
Can I ask a quick question mid-presentation, just to kind of understand how you got here? Explaining like the politics, like you said, when the Conservatives came in, they had a clear mandate of what they wanted to do. But was it to reduce benefit spending? Was it to consolidate or like make the process, or was it make the government systems smoother, or was it thinking about the user experience?
I would not say they were thinking about the user experience. It was not driven by that we used the opportunity to become more user focused. Their drive was the idea that if you simplify the benefit system, if you make it so that you're on a benefit that changes to your circumstances and you don't have to chop and change from different benefit programs, then it will make it easier to move from being unemployed. That was the basic policy, was make it easy to work and make work pay. You actually go into a lot of detail on this, it's slightly complicated. You actually end up with more money in your pocket because of things like taper rates, which is why I didn't want to go there. But so it was kind of driven from let's make the welfare state make work a kind of rational, sensible choice, which it definitely wasn't in the old system. That was their driving rationale.
Okay, yeah, and then to just sort of give a little bit of sense of what we're doing now as Public Digital. So Public Digital was formed, Ben, a CEO over there, tell me exactly, but kind of 6 or 7 years ago by some of the team who'd set up government digital service in the UK. We've grown over that time, bringing people like Lara on board. We work with public institutions and private institutions that matter around the world. We usually predate the internet and now need to work out how to adapt and how to thrive in the internet era. And we bring a lot of lived experience of stories like what Lara mentioned, setting up government digital service and others, which means lots of things that have worked and also lots of mistakes that we've learned from. And rather than talk a lot about the whole portfolio of what we do, I wanted to sort of just briefly touch on one particular project where we've really been able to bring that kind of what worked and some mistakes that we've made in the past to bear, which is the reform of farm funding in the UK, which we're finding interesting to work on, partly because it's the one thing that we found post-Brexit as being something that we can actually get enthusiastic about. So before Brexit, farms in the UK were subsidised through a European Union set of policies and rules. Money kind of flowed from the UK to the EU and then back to farmers. And that meant you had a set of rules that was agreed through a lot of compromises, but more importantly, very, very slowly. So it's a system that was hard to adapt and to change. And leaving the European Union, Britain obviously still needs to fund farming. We still need some food security. But we had a sort of imperative to redesign that system. So an opportunity to make it much more responsive. So our Department of Food and Rural Affairs set up a new program, Future Farming Program, to reinvent that service. It very quickly became very big and complicated, with an excellent leader who has a lot of digital experience, but inherited a huge amount of complexity. A lot of people who'd kind of picked up some of the language around how you do digital, been talking in terms of discoveries and alphas and all of the language that kind of came out of GDS, but had really created a sprawling portfolio of different initiatives that didn't neatly fit together, and also weren't really deliverable, because it wasn't at all clear where you'd start or how you made sense of that to farmers. So we've been working over the last few months to a very similar set of principles to the ones that Laura outlined with that team. So I think three main things. One is to help them go through that portfolio of things that they were doing and rationalize it and start to organize it based on a set of outcomes they're trying to achieve into what would one service look like. Really, farmers want need funding. That's the service that we need to provide, but we have to clear through that portfolio and kind of lay out what outcomes are each of the things in it trying to achieve, and how might you sort of stage those outcomes and progressively develop them. Another is really help them do that, making best friends with the operational colleagues, which is something which when we were in GDS, we got involved in farm funding reform and we didn't do. And that was a big failure on our part, because we didn't learn from the experience of the people who deal with farmers day to day, who have to handle all of the edge cases there. We didn't want that to repeat. So we went up to Workington in the northwest of England, to this windswept, rainy office, met the operational people, and it helped the kind of core policy and digital teams within DEFRA get to know them, build some empathy, and understand that they can only be successful together. And then we worked a lot with the leadership team that formed there, which was a bit too big. It's become a bit smaller, but to help them start to operate as a team rather than a set of people who had kind of functional responsibilities. I own that bit of the portfolio, I own HR, I own finance. You're a leadership team working together to deliver these outcomes. And it's still fairly early days on that, but they're now organised around this one single service that they're going to work on. And what that allows them to do is first know where to start. If you're working on one service, you start on that service and you can kind of figure out what the starting point on it is. But they can also really deeply embed a feedback loop that lets them understand how do the delivery of the kind of technology in the middle of it, but also the policy and the operational pieces. How do they fit together? And how as a team can you iterate that week to week, month to month, quarter to quarter, as you get closer to farmers, as you start to really grapple with the complexity of the service. And one thing that has also come out of it is they've been able to avoid a lot of traps that come with kind of false binaries that you often set up in these sorts of programs. So one that's been, so my background as a technologist, one that's been very much apparent to me is that there wasn't quite at the point of confrontation, but it was brewing towards a confrontation between kind of the legacy old technology that existed and the greenfield new opportunity. And it's kind of ideological. We want to stick with the devil we know versus we really ought to build something new. By building that feedback loop and by getting close to the operations folks, they can focus on the outcome they're trying to achieve, not the technology ideology. So there's still a long way to go with this farming reform, but there's now a core single service team and a core leadership team who see themselves as leaders, and is very similar to a lot of the other work.
Okay. So I want to give folks plenty of chances to ask questions. I do want to ask one, at least one to get rolling, which is I like to understand the roads not taken. So, for instance, you mentioned early on in the process, a couple of years in, almost £500 million spent, nothing to show for it really. Someone in the center had the authority and also the moxie to say no, stop. If if that person hadn't been there, or if that authority hadn't existed, was there any way that the ship was gonna turn? And how important was that? And are there other moments along the way that were definitive for the success or failure of the enterprise?
That's such a good question. I thought I'd been asked all the questions. I think what would have happened is like stuff was being built. It was being built entirely in Conway's law. So it was being it was horrific, like the different 3 big IT suppliers.
Do you want to tell folks, for folks in the room who don't know what Conway's law is?
Conway's law. So the basic principle of Conway's law is that you design something that reflects your current organization. So to the point where one big IT supplier would build like the rules engine and another IT supplier would build the technology bit, and none of the processes joined up because so stuff was being built, but it was being built entirely in a reflection of the existing shape of the organization. And that would, and indeed did, I don't really talk about this because it complicates the story. That kind of first service version of universal credit did end up going live. And it actually provided us with a pretty amazing umbrella, because every time anyone wanted to know what we're doing, we were like, yeah, just go and look over there for now. But the problem, so I think what ultimately would have happened is that it would have been a tiny shadow of its ambition, universal credit. So they couldn't, it wouldn't have been a truly digital service. There was no security baked in. So the way what we have is properly digital. It would have ended up being a kind of digital front end and everything else just a black box behind, because they couldn't kind of like let the data out of the black box. And I think it would have served a much narrower group of people. So that first version, when I talked about just let anyone who might be entitled turn up and learn, so that we could, we from the outset could serve anyone who might be entitled to universal credit under the policy. That first version said, okay, we're only going to let certain type of people in to begin with. And I think it would have stalled, it would never have got beyond there. So it would have only ever served a subset of its ambition, and it would never have been digital in the sense that the service actually is. So, people have an account, you can communicate with your work coach when you're looking for work, you can check on your status, everything is enabled, and it applies to your digital account, and it wouldn't.
One thing just to sort of add to that is the stopping it, the alarm bells were coming from lots of places. So Lara showed a slide which was a parliamentary investigation into what was going on, because when that much money is going on something that's not delivering, Parliament starts paying attention. There's also, obviously, GDS was paying a lot of attention, but there was also a major programs authority in the UK that sort of supervises all big spend, who were giving it very, very severe reports. There were lots of things that were saying this isn't right and it should probably stop in its current form. But what was absolutely essential was that there was somebody going in and saying, but we could do it differently. And that's what the principles that Lara showed started to establish. We can go about this in a different way, because I doubt anybody would have stopped it, but they were willing to take a new direction on it.
Were there other make or break moments? One that maybe comes to mind as a prompt is you mentioned how important it was that you became very tight very early with the head of operational delivery. If that relationship had gotten off on the wrong foot, or are there other moments that you can look back and go, oh gosh, like if this hadn't happened, the whole thing would have been.
So the one on operational delivery, it's not like it wouldn't have happened if we had to kind of become best friends with more to it than that, but it's not that it wouldn't have happened, but it's that part of the design of the service, we went from an organization designed entirely around managing tasks, circumstances. So that wouldn't have happened.
And that was
Because
despite the whatever titles and fiefdoms people had.
despite all of that, we changed accountabilities so that we, rather than having operational accountability for different functions in the organization, we changed that so that all accountability became geographical. So you had end-to-end operational accountability for the user experience. Those sorts of things that changed the entire nature of the culture of the organization would not have happened. So you would have had a version of universal credit, but not a version that put the users so much at the heart of it. There was one other make or break moment, which, and this is a bit tricky with the kind of legacy, like greenfield, brownfield thing. There was a decision, well, because a lot of money had been spent, there was a lot of political, big P and small p, desire to reuse anything that had already been created, because that would make it a lot easier if you're not having to write off all that money. And although as a team we were quite empathetic to that, there was a really big push for us to use the calculation engine. And so there was an important moment where we had to make the decision whether or not that was a hill we were going to die on. Like, you've got to pick your battles, right? You've got to be pragmatic. That engine sits at the heart of the user experience. And if we had reused what we'd been built, it's not that it would have been wrong, it's that we wouldn't have been able to iterate it along. And so we decided we would die on that hill. It was an almighty battle, but we did win. So I think picking the battles is really important because you can't fight all of them all the time. But that one was a pretty much make or break one.
Lots of questions. Please, Shannon.
Were you brought in as outsiders to an existing team, as an agency? I was curious, how did you manage that relationship?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I was an insider, as an insider to Department of Work and Pensions. One of the other public digital partners, Tom Loosemore, was the GDS outsider, and we kind of built the team together. Absolutely geniusly, Mike Bracken, who's also in Washington this week, and also GDS person, he insisted that this new team was set up outside of DWP premises so that we were not infected by, you can imagine this pretty toxic environment by this point. So partly not affected by that, but partly that we could create our own culture. Mm-hmm. So we set that team up in really incredibly grotty offices, but they were ours, and that's what mattered. So I think that kind of helping even the insiders be out of this big cultural organization was an important part. And we did eventually go home after 6 years in our separate offices. It was brilliant. We went home and demanded that we had the entire floor of the Department for Work and Pensions fitted out to meet our needs. That was awesome.
Now you say outsider. What you mean is outside of the department, but still inside the government of the UK.
Yeah.
So, which leads to another interesting question, which is that $425 million, or pounds, pardon me, in the first 3 years had probably been spent largely on vendors. What was the vendors' reaction to your arrival and to your progress, and what was their involvement, up to present day?
There was a lot going on in the background, a lot of that pressure. So Lara talked about the not wanting to write off the spend that had gone on. There was also an element of that, which was that not wanting to push those vendors completely outside straight away. But over time, and Lara knows more of the details of this, but over time it became clearer and clearer that the future of the service was the new thing that the new team was using. And the vendors are largely gone from that. They're still present in other parts of the system. Some vendors responded well across government to saying, actually, government now expects different things of you, expects you to work in different ways, others not so much. And that's where things like the technology code of practice that the UK government has, and the digital service standard, and things like that, are really important, not just sort of to manage quality, also to send that message back to vendors. We're not saying no more vendors, we're saying play by our rules now.
And if it's, there are, as Jane says, within the universal credit immediate ecosystems, very few kind of vendors present, where as a kind of principle about how you think about when to use stuff that you might buy it and so on, the team now will look to, if there is anything that is to be bought in, to make it a really like small component. So the kind of like the intellectual understanding of this service as an ecosystem always exists wholly within the department now. And that means it becomes safer actually to say, do you know what, it's fine if someone delivers a little bit of it, but we understand the boundaries of it, and it is the smallest thing that we can reduce it to, because that means it's safe, and also it means you can swap it in and out. You don't become dependent.
Yeah. There was often a principle about even when you're buying something, you should understand how it's built to the point where with enough time and money, you could reproduce it. You don't want to spend that time and money, so that's why you buy it. But that at least means when a contract comes to an end, you have options.
And yeah, please.
Also, folks can speak louder so the virtual attendees can hear. Thanks.
Sure. So you talked a fair bit about the need to also think about the organizational and kind of operational shifts in addition to technology. And thinking about our system here, I think we often struggle a lot because our services are so disaggregated across different departments. You can often be quite territorial over, the spend that comes with those services. And so was hoping you could just talk a little bit about, was there anything you did or messaging you used that was effective in kind of getting the buy-in that if we don't shift the org and the ops, just the technology pieces themselves are going to fall flat if we don't make those broader changes?
Yeah, that is a good question. I mean, I think if I can answer it in a slightly indirect way, and one of the things I haven't mentioned is that we have something in the UK called senior responsible officers, and they are accountable to Parliament for delivering really, really big programs. And in the case of universal credit, that senior responsible officer happened to embody a background in, not in technology actually, but in operational delivery and policy making. And he is a very, very charismatic leader. And I think having leaders that can really understand the nature of the different functions and can bring those functions together as a team was a really important part of it. But also this kind of test and learn, you're not going to test and learn technology, you're testing and learning how a service generates behavior. And I think that kind of as a rallying cry, what is your rallying cry to bring people to look at the whole of a service? It's test and learn for us. I was in a session, a kind of leadership session the other day saying, if you don't use Agile, what do you use? I'm like, I don't know, whatever works for you, right? It's let's not replace one word with just another that has to be I think the rallying cry for what works for that organization that makes it clear that this is kind of this is system wide.
I think when I've been thinking about other successful examples of this sort of change, it's usually when there's some substantial new policy outcome that somebody wants to achieve, where there's already a recognition that we're not going to be able to deliver that in the way that we have delivered it. And so it's not digital for digital's sake or better technology for better technology's sake, or even better technology for experience's sake. It's things like, so one of the services we have is lasting power of attorney. So it's preparing for the point when you can't manage your own affairs. And the agency responsible for that knew that with a rapidly aging population, the way that they supported that population would have to change substantially. So that recognition was already there. You could then come in with these ways of working, say this is how we can support that. Or driving transformation. There was a move to say, we're going to shift how cars get taxed. Necessarily, that will have policy implications. It will have operational issues. It will have big data issues. The driving force was we need to make that change to driving. Not we need to fix the legacy technology in the driving part of the organization. So you've already got some mental construct that says we know that this isn't going to look like what we had before with better technology. It's going to look like a transformed organization.
Do you have a question, Tim?
Oh, yeah. It's a slight change of topic, but to your point that the agreeing to the 3-year timeline was a big problem, I'm curious how, timelines do provide value sometimes, right? To give like accountability and what to expect. How did you blend in the new version, like the test and learn with giving some semblance of here's what to expect when?
Yeah, that is such a good question. I have a very clear recollection of sitting down with like the kind of program manager who we'd done a lot of coaching like about we're kind of moving away from this kind of Prince to like view of the world, and he said, well, what can we put on the program board? Like, what are we going to say to the program board? And I said, well, we could do like phase 1, 2, and 3. And he was like, yeah, that's not going to cut it. Laura was like, nice try. So we did have these phases, but we always worked in phases. And the early phases were things like, okay, we're going to like this phase, we're going to test this thing. And this next phase, we're going to see if we can connect to another bit of the department. Like, can we connect to the payment system? Like, so the first bit was like, do people even understand? Like, universal credit is based on a household. It's a household benefit that doesn't exist anywhere in the world. It's like the first bit is like, can we even do this? And then so those phases, and that's a lot of education. Instead of going, yeah, we will have delivered, previously we were like, we'll have delivered 20% of the technology, such date. So you do have to work quite hard to find the good expression of what you can be held accountable for and how people can track progress. You can't just complain about how that's the wrong thing to do.
You mentioned the loop between operational delivery and policy and the iterative nature of that. The fact that you were able to create an iteration loop that included the policy making and policy adjusting. So that can be tough, especially when sometimes the legislation is quite specific about, you mentioned work to outcomes free of implied solutions. Sometimes the solutions are not only implied, but hard-coded into the law or into the policies that you're going to need a lot of chiseling and hammering to get out or change. Was the law blessedly free of those lockdown limitations for you? Were there large efforts you had to undergo to get the policy to a place where it could be amenable to the feedback loop from operational delivery?
Yeah, so two things for universal credit anyway. One is we weren't blessed because we were clever. So we should take some credit. We knew because we have like lived experience of how difficult legislation can be, making changes. So we worked really hard on creating the universal credit policy to make sure it didn't go into service design. So the policy doesn't say how things should be done. It just says what the rules are. And that was, if you have the opportunity to do that, that's pretty amazing. So that saved our bacon in quite a lot of ways. So it doesn't say things like, you have to do this in a face-to-face environment, or you have to have that in writing, whatever. So that gives you a lot of latitude. And then we ran a process which we called our hard issues, doesn't matter what we call it. And basically it was a way of saying, if you run into a piece of policy that just is like bad from a service design and delivery point of view, you flag it and we take it up the chain to policy and ministers if necessary. And actually one of our lead ministers on universal credit for years, he kind of flipped his politics to carry on with this. He said in 2013, he said, "Thank God people have started bringing me policy problems. Like, how can it be true that, like, we came up with this policy and it was all fine?" And they actually lapped it up to begin with, because they were like, we can't have got it all right, just sitting around the table going. So, but I think what's important is that we created a culture where it was quite hard work, I have to be fair, where policy people expected us to come back to them and say, actually this thing is causing us a problem, like how do we do something about it?
Yeah, I was thinking about the lasting power of attorney service. It's one where it's a much simpler service in almost every way. But just in doing bringing that online, there were written into legislation details of what forms should look like. And so, those are kind of hard constraints. And so initially all the team could really do as a tactic, it was things like, you must actually write your address on page 1 and page 5, and then you must have a wet signature here. So we're just able to use a little bit of JavaScript that says copy the address that I've got on page 1 onto page 5. Just doing that kind of thing massively reduced the failure rate that agency was dealing with. 25% of applications they were receiving on paper had to be sent back because somebody had drawn an A differently on page 5 from on page 1 and somebody couldn't read it. That was a hack around it, because really that sort of duplication shouldn't be there in the first place. They had to do let's deliver those hacks first and build the relationships with the policy people in their agency to set things up so that 2 years later, some legislation had been drafted that went in that just simplified things and said, there's no need for law to go into that level of detail. Delivering something quickly and folk then building those relationships. Set them on that path.
We are at time. There's so much to talk about. Always, especially with this. I want to close reading a comment that came in online, which says, not a question here, but current UC Universal Credit team member watching. Just want to say Laura is hugely missed and remains the figurehead we all look to. UC is filled with so many committed people delivering change to British citizens, and Laura inspired it. Hands up. With that, I want to thank Laura and James, of course, and Ben for coming out and making this part of their trip across the pond, a stop here at the Beeck Center at Georgetown. I want to thank Julia, Ben, who did so much work to make this event possible. Terry, if you're out there listening, who helped with the AV and the room reservation and everything else. Corey and everyone at the Beeck Center who make all of this possible at all and give me a job to come to. Thank you so much for coming and for attending online as well. Everybody out there, hope you enjoyed it. And with any luck, we will have this up online before too long as well for posterity. I believe firmly that telling these stories and getting into the details of what worked and what didn't and what could have been and wasn't a really important piece of the puzzle here as we all try to help folks overcome some of the fears you talked about and move toward working in better ways together. So thank you so much for sharing this with us. Really appreciate it.